Mike Stever's Mike, right? Yeah. The pride of Madrid, right? He knows his way around the list. Commissioner of Public Safety, Michael Sauschuck.
Well, before Mike starts his presentation on two different initiatives, I do want to speak to the little bit of history. Representative Patrick Corey is here. The Maine School Safety Center, when I left the legislature, was not done.
This is David bragging about himself again.
Well,
So listen up, all right?
Well, actually,
He's bragging about me, so that's good.
So that's right. Every effort in the legislature needs a champion, and there's several of them in the room. Many of them will be on the panel later. Representative Corey, I went to him and said, this is important. He immediately grabbed it and dogged it like a hound for 2 or 3 more years until it was done. So thank you for the work that you did on that. With that, the programs that Commissioner Sauschuck is going to speak to are fairly new as well. One of them is the so-called yellow flag law, as well as safe storage. And the sponsor of the safe storage bill is with us, Senator DeChambeau, just a wonderful legislator, and it's going to be a lot of fun to work with. So, Commissioner, when you get done with your presentation, I know that both Jonathan and Commissioner Sauschuck need to leave a little later, so when he's done, the opportunity to ask questions will be at that time, and then I expect them to leave. So I just wanted to say that. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Yep. Well, thanks, Dave, for that. I appreciate it. It's good to see everybody, and certainly thanks for having me here. I am proud to follow the Maine School Safety Center. It's a great initiative. It's a very powerful tool we have in the state of Maine. And I'll also say, since we're bragging about folks, that the Department of Education and really the entire state of Maine is lucky that we have Jonathan involved that's in this role, really kicking that program off. Anytime you have a new program, we talk about champions, they hit the ground immediately with respect across the entire state for their careers and their focus on youth. And Jonathan, in particular, you talk about the Maine State Police, he was championing youth services in rural communities, primarily down in York County, forever. Long before that was a thing, he was doing that. And if you talk about Bob and his experience as a school resource officer, you can talk the talk because they've done it, they live it, they care about it, and you can see the passion that Jonathan's portraying here at the microphone already today. So thank you for that. Thank you for those partnerships. Thanks to Dave and to Bill, and I appreciate them having us here for the Department of Public Safety. So what is the Department of Public Safety, right? What's that whole thing about? So that's 643 various employees that work for various bureaus within DPS. The Maine State Police, that's 331 sworn. That's twice the size of the next agency in the state of Maine. We have Maine Drug Enforcement. We have the Capitol Police. We have the Maine Criminal Justice Academy. There is some dispatch components to that. There's EMS. There's highway safety. There's gambling control. So there's a mix of those things falling under that DPS umbrella. So for us, day in and day out, I'll tell you that traditionally, the state of Maine has been in the top 3 safest states in the country. And that's been that way for a long, long time. We're certainly proud of that. And we're proud of that at all levels. I think we've got great partnerships at that local level, the county level, the state level, and all of those things that matter across the board. And I think we also have incredibly strong partnerships with entities like SAM and other organizations out there. Whether it's Sportsman's Alliance or behavioral health entities or community partners, I think all of those folks are at the table on a regular basis to help us accomplish the mission, which is what it's all about at the end of the day. If we're doing our job, then we're in fact keeping communities safe. The programs that Dave asked me to touch on today, for starters, is a safe homes program. And this is something that Dave brought to my attention, that Senator DeChambeau brought to my attention. A true champion, Representative Dick Pickett, who's a retired Maine State Trooper, who was the chief of the Dixfield Police Department, was a co-sponsor of this bill. And we talked about it, and it hit at a time where it actually got carried over to the next session because we were running hard near the end, and that's good because it gave us an opportunity to dig into that a little bit further. So in the next session, when we brought it forward, we had strong partnerships from the Maine Sheriffs, which is routine. They certainly wanted to be involved in this entire process. And between the legislature and the work that we were doing at DPS and SAM, we're able to stand up what amounts to a safe storage bill and more importantly, a safe storage program for the state of Maine. So we've got some exciting news about how this particular program has evolved, but really the primary focus here, as LD 1861, an act to establish the Safe Home Program, kind of had three different levels. And the first one was that it declared September as a Safe Homes Month, right? There's a lot of different months and weeks and days and all that stuff, but I think the importance is that it does help you focus on one time frame. And you're gonna say, we're gonna make September Safe Homes Month, so let's try to put our programming there, let's try to hit our social media there, let's really try to focus and get the word out about safe storage. So as a piece of that, Governor Mills put out a proclamation declaring that, and we used last September as an opportunity to go out and hit our radio partners, hit a lot of social media stuff, and try to get the word out about what safe storage looks like in Maine. And something we've been all in on from the beginning is that what safe storage is talking about prescription medications, right? It's talking about dangerous weapons, and sure, it's talking about firearms as well, but it's important in the state of Maine, when we look at 713 fatal overdoses last year, 10,000 overall overdoses, that we make sure that we put that right in the front of everybody's mind as much as humanly possible. Because I think it can easily have a safe storage conversations as well. It must be just about firearms, and it's not, and nor should it be. Now, it's also okay to say the reality that about 85% of our firearms fatalities in the state of Maine are suicides, right? That's a problem that we all want to make sure that we deal with. Let's focus on the people in our communities that are in a mental health crisis or a behavioral health crisis. So when we talk about safe storage, those are generally the buckets that we're looking at. And so how do we make those situations safer? How do we do our job when we talk about safe storage? So a piece of that was the educational side of this. So we spent some time with Ray Richardson, who I would consider a close friend of mine. I've been on his show dozens of times on various issues. And certainly George Hale and Rick Tyler are good friends of law enforcement, and to talk about safe homes and get the words out. We did a few different media opportunities with television stations. And more importantly, we used every one of those as a chance to put a social media post out, just absolutely pounding on safe homes, safe storage, safe storage, safe storage. Because it's going to take repetitions, right, to make that happen for people across the board. So we start with that, and then there's a strong focus. We want to get grant programs. We want to provide money to individuals in the communities and the law enforcement agencies to give them the tools that they need locally. And that could be a family. I just have a loved one that I'm really concerned about. Let's get a lockbox. Could be a law enforcement agency that needs an entire solution, and they've got guns stacked in a closet, right? Which is not a rarity from an evidence standpoint in smaller agencies all over the state. So we were looking at that. Now, funding being what it is, we didn't have any funding the first time around in 22, but I do have some great news on that in just a second. So we did start an account, we opened an account, so we're ready to go if we got federal earmarks or if we got any kind of benefactor, if you will, to swoop in and throw us that big check. And then during the workshop, in the work session around this bill, there was a lot of strong opinions around education. And people that were very focused, we want you to do this education versus that education. And I'll tell you, as a practitioner, somebody that would stand a program up like this, I'm always leery about a lot of very specific language in bills, because I know I'm not going to get any money for it. that's the reality. Somebody, oh, it'd be great if you did all these PSAs, it'd be great if you did this, it'd be great if you do that. And the answer is, yeah, that would be great. You going to fund any of those programs or not? And generally speaking, the answer is no. So we kept the language pretty broad, and I appreciate Dave's support, knowing that we were going to have to stand this thing up, that we didn't get too crazy with line items about this has to be in there, this has to be in there, that has to be in there. So what we focused on with no money and zero budget was an educational opportunity. And that meant that we developed a website, and we contacted a bunch of our partners, to include SAM. You can talk about the Office of Children and Family Services, you can talk about Office of Behavioral Health, NAMI Maine, all of these different entities, and said, so if this is our overall mission, what existing website, what existing material would you like to see here? Because then I'll go out and pound it and try to push people to that website. one-stop shopping for information. So that's what we ended up doing. We ended up getting different samples from a lot of those different partners and putting those into a website. Again, if you go back to No Budget, that's a website that one of our Maine State Police Command staff members developed, and that we put the information in. So we don't have to wait on anybody else. We're not accountable to anybody else sending me a bill and, hey, we need to do this, we need to do that. We can control that within DPS. So that's what we did. And the idea behind the website is that it was a bipartisan location where I don't care if your source, the people that you trust, is the VA, or it is pediatricians, or it's the CDC, or it's providers for behavioral health issues, or it's the firearm industry, or gun safety folks as they would say they are. Whatever the terminology is, I don't care. We just want people to be safe in their houses. That's it. So we put all of those different voices on a website. So if somebody decided to go there, they can pick and choose how they see fit. And do whatever you think is the most appropriate for you in your world. If you're worried about your kids, there's websites on there. If you're worried about trauma in our veterans, there's a website that's specific to that. So there's a lot of material that were there on the website, as well as highlighting some bills, to include the Safe Homes Bill, the Good Samaritan Bill, an amended child endangerment law, and Representative Corey's exemption and deduction for purchase of firearm safety device. That's a long way of saying that that's a tax break, right, for, again, safety devices that you could buy, that anywhere from a trigger lock to a wall safe. And Sam did a nice video with this, and Dave kind of walked through the purchase of it's a hypothetical, right? There's a safe at Cabela's. This is how much it costs. I'm going to include, in this particular scenario, the SAM discount, as well as the tax break. And it went from $1,000 safe down to $700 and some dollars. And Patrick, who's a Wyndham guy and a great partner in the first couple of years of criminal justice as a member there, the vast majority of the hits that we had on that website were people that were going to that specific bill. Because even people that are in the business and hunt weren't familiar with that. I'm talking to Ray Richardson. He's like, what are you talking about? I didn't know that existed. And I think you actually texted in while I was there that day to highlight that, which I think was cool. So it's just one of those things that's been out there, and it's important. And it's us as a state, us as partners, trying to put this resource out there. But if you don't know, you don't know what you don't know, right? Until somebody can say, hey, this is an opportunity out there that you can save some cash. And, in fact, make your home safer from prescription medications or dangerous weapons or firearms or whatever is the most appropriate in your particular world. So those are the things that we kind of kicked that off with. And I would say, and Dave touched on this, but Senator Deschambault, who was here, was the Senate Chair of Criminal Justice Public Safety. She's from Biddeford. You may not know her. She's been in this building before, been different events for Sam, no doubt about it. But we couldn't have a stronger partner for law enforcement than Sue. I can't tell you the number of grenades that she threw herself on over the years, trying to help first responders all over the state. And you're lucky to have her here as part of a panel, a true champion for the kind of work that we do day in and day out. Other things that we were able to accomplish, we were able to get 80 lock boxes that the Office of Behavioral Health had laying around. They bought them for a different purpose, a different program. The Maine Mom program, which involves opioid and pregnant moms. But that didn't work. They decided to go away from that in that particular program. So one of our partners, the program manager over there, gave me a shout and said, we got 80 of these things. Do you think that would be a good fit for the Safe Homes program? And again, having no funding, I was like, we'll be there in 3 seconds to pick those up. Give us something that we can, in fact, give out to people. Now, there's a bunch of experienced people in here. The lockbox, and well, it'd be great for this, and great for prescription drugs, and great for guns and everything else. I'm excited. I go over there and pick them up, and there's a big sign on the side that says, not for firearms, right? Like, well, it has to take a special lockbox for that to occur. But on the prescription side, that was incredibly important for us to get that out to options programs through the state. That's behavioral health liaisons and co-responders, and they're kind of leading the charge with one of those options liaison in every single state, every single county rather, across the state. And to give those lock boxes that would then be focused on prescription medications to a bunch of the recovery centers around the state. So those are hubs where people that are suffering from behavioral health issues would go into and now they have something they can proactively give to somebody. If your medications, you're at the house, you want to lock those things down, you got kids, here's something that can make your world safer. So that was actually a hands-on thing that we were pretty excited to be able to do. And then on top of that, again, with no funding that first round, Derek Gorneau, who is a gentleman who is the deputy commissioner within DPS, wrote his first grant, and that was a 22-23 burn state crisis intervention program proposal. We had submitted a grant for $1.234 million and received that, which again takes us from a website, a static location that we'll try to push people to actually being able to facilitate the grant piece of the Safe Homes program, which is incredibly cool for us. And I think incredibly valuable to the entire state. So that grant had 5 particular priority areas. One of them is developing a crisis intervention strategic plan. We should all be consultants because they get way, way too much money. But as far as a grant proposal, the scenario here is that we weren't going to get this grant unless we had some kind of a strategic plan that went with it and a consultant that went with that to track data and information over a 4-year period. So that's fine. We did put that in as a priority area. And I think for me, as a practitioner, again, strategic plans are good because I don't get 100 of them. Our legislators get overloaded with strategic plans and annual reports and how do they keep up with all that stuff. If there's a way for us to say we started over here, we ended up over here because we did these things, then we're learning and we're trying to get better and we're trying to create a system that's better suited for our state and for keeping our people safe. So this consultant will be able to track data over that 4-year time period. There's a piece in here that enhancing communication, education, public awareness, things of that nature. That's that piece where now Safe Homes has some money that in fact we can do some of that stuff and branch out beyond a website. So we're excited about that piece. And then you have the safe storage piece from a law enforcement perspective, which is the lion's share of this money. And when you talk about burn stuff and grants, there's a Justice Assistance Grant, a JAG grant, that is issued to law enforcement agencies around the country based on crime rates. So you may have a smaller agency with a lower crime rate that doesn't get any money from JAG. And then it works its way all the way up. My time in Portland, we get 90,000. That's not something to be proud of. That's because your crime rate, you're doing enough work that they're giving you money because you think there's a problem there. So there's 2 different aspects of this. So the $25,000 that would go to Safe Homes marketing, from 0 to 25 grand every year over the next 4 years, that's exciting. Law enforcement storage, $268,249, and we've got that front loaded in that first year, but we can spread that over that 4-year period, however that looks. That's a competitive process. So that means that people, they're already getting JAG funding, one level or another, they're going to compete by submitting grant applications. So I hope to see I got a 5-year trend that generally we take in 7 firearms for whatever reason a year, and I want to buy a safe. And I think that would be the best way to safely store some firearms, as the people in this room certainly know, that are high value, that could be antiques, that all of the things that we know that make them particular. They're not throwaway 22 calibers from the Czech Republic that people or gangbangers are using on the road. These are high-end guns that, for whatever reason, law enforcement may have. We want to make sure we're storing them properly so they don't get banged up, they don't get damaged, and we can keep them safe. So that's a lot of money for that. And then there's another $227,360 that's for the folks that don't get JAG grants. That's non-competitive, so they don't have to compete with people. We'll be going through the sheriff's departments at each county level to come into one location with them as kind of sub-grantees, and then we push the money out to the agencies that they work with on a regular basis. So there's really good stuff happening on that Safe Homes program, and that's kind of what we had hoped, is that we would in fact end up with some money there, and in fact that did occur. So very exciting on that end. And as they've mentioned before, whether it was Jonathan or Dave or anybody else, I'm happy to take questions on anything at any point. But I could roll over into the yellow flag stuff if you like.
I'd just like to let folks know there's a bunch of handouts on the back table by the 490-pound bear that's mounted in the corner. And,
Pretty subtle.
Just go to the Big Bear.
just go to the,
Is he bragging again? Did he shoot
Did he
that?
shoot that Patrick? I don't know.
Is there a plaque on that somewhere?
so there are a bunch of handouts that give more information about all the stuff he's talking about. So I encourage you to grab some of that information if you want to learn more about it.
Yeah, so any questions on anything, feel free. Roll it over to weapons restriction orders and that process. When Dave called about these two issues happen to be ones that I'm the primary on. Obviously, we farm out different projects to a bunch of different people, whether it's the state police or the other bureaus. So the yellow flag process is kind of the way most people refer to this. That went into effect in July 1st of 2020. So it's 2.5 years-ish or so ago. And since that time, we've had 36 scenarios where these orders have been issued. We had 35, the 36th happened last night in Westbrook, as a matter of fact, after I had sent this out already. If you see nothing else, I would encourage you to take a look at that list, because I think the list is very powerful in and of itself, and I'll touch on that again here in just a second. But so what does our weapons restriction order process law look like in Maine? You may have heard of red flag across the country. That means different things in different states. But for us, there is a process where if a law enforcement officer believes somebody is mentally ill for one, and that they are likelihood of serious harm against themselves or somebody else, that they would take them into protective custody, which means they're going to detain them and transport them to primarily ERs in the state of Maine to receive an assessment and evaluation about where they are from a crisis standpoint. And that happens multitudes of times around the state every single day. I think my personal record was 8 times to the Maine Medical Center ER in 1 8-hour shift for people, every one of them in a behavioral health crisis at one level or another. So that does happen on a regular basis. So that's a baseline of mentally ill and likelihood of serious harm and the 2 criteria to take somebody into protective custody. As far as a yellow flag or a weapons restriction order, the next level to that is that there's some kind of probable cause that they have weapons, and then you're connecting those weapons to that likelihood that they're going to hurt somebody. And that means that they're in protective custody, and now, do they have a likelihood of foreseeable harm? So right now, they're a threat to themselves or others. If down the road, in foreseeable harm, are they going to hurt somebody else with the weapons that they have access to? That's the dynamic, that's the question. So for us, as law enforcement officers, you start that out by the protective custody threshold that I just discussed. And that means you have your hands on them, they're in protective custody, I'm going to take them to an ER. They get to an emergency room, and throughout that process, now you're thinking, all right, they have weapons, in most cases, as you'll see on that list, they had weapons, most of the times a firearm, that they're directly threatening themselves or threatening somebody else with. Pointing a firearm at somebody, pointing a firearm at themselves, pointing a firearm at law enforcement, and saying, they're seeking out suicide by cop as an example. Whether they say it out loud or all the other criteria are there for that to occur. So if you have that, then you would go to a hospital and you'd ask to implement this yellow flag law. And I'll just go through what it was intended to be, and then I'll touch on kind of where it ended up. So ideally, you go to your ER, which you go to on a regular basis with situations like this. You ask one of the medical practitioners there to perform a yellow flag assessment. So they're going to look at from likelihood of serious harm and move that over a smidge to say likelihood of foreseeable harm. That's pushing you out a little bit further than the immediacy of that particular issue. So a doctor, depending on the criteria and the definition of medical practitioner, would do that assessment. If in fact they have enough information to believe that there is a connection there and there's a concern long term, then they would in fact sign off as a medical practitioner that they think that is an ongoing concern for that individual. So now the officer has that information. They're going to go to the courts and they're going to ask a judge to sign off that they all agree on this. The officer starts it, the docs approve it, and then the judges sign off on it. Then you go back to that hospital setting, you serve the individual with that order and say, you know, this is what's going on here. We have the authority, we have the responsibility now to get any firearms that you may have, so you can't hurt anybody. That's the primary concern. You can't hurt yourself when you get out of here. So within 5 days, district attorneys are going to do some stuff. Within 14 days, there's going to be an initial hearing. And then what ultimately happens is that this order could be continued out to a year. Now, when we've seen these happen in the state of Maine so far, I don't know of any that are actually a year, because district attorneys, like any other walk of life, they would seek a consent agreement, so it's a deal. They'll say, oh, we don't go to hearing, and maybe we'll keep the firearms for 6 months rather than a year. Is that good for everybody? Attorneys sign off on it, everybody agrees, and off you go. So that's the overarching process that you're supposed to have. What we found with the law is that hospitals, two primary hospital systems, and that would be Maine Health and Northern Light, had some concerns with the original language of the bill. And they were concerned because their doctors would say, I don't think it's safe for us to be involved in an assessment that may take somebody's firearms away from them, right? So automatically, not only are they in a behavioral health crisis of some sort, but then we're going to tell them that we're going to take your guns. I'm the doctor, I'm looking at you, we're having a conversation. Because of that conversation, somebody took your weapons away from you. And now that person may come back and focus their anger on that doctor or on that ER or on that particular system. So doctors were concerned about that. So that ultimately led to hospital associations and these systems pushing back to say, hey, listen, we're not interested in doing these assessments at all. And if you add the Maine Health System and Northern Light, it's about 90% of hospitals across the state. So we went from, you know, people who are navigating this system, it was still probably pretty new, to a lot of those doors were now closed. So definitely slowed down the use of the original yellow flag statute. And hospitals and the hospital association would say, well, listen, our doctors were nervous about this. So you put in, hey, telehealth, that you can do these via telehealth. You put that in the bill, but the state hasn't complied. There isn't a telehealth option out there anyplace. So instead, you still got to physically bring them into the ER every time instead of potentially doing these assessments off-site via telehealth. And they were right. There's some other stuff in there, I won't bore you, but officers are required, or they could use telehealth if it was available and if it was appropriate. I can easily argue and did that in many of these cases I didn't think it was appropriate because these people that are on this list are incredibly ill. There's very, very, very dangerous and dynamic situations happening here that were exactly why this law existed, and it exists today, right? So what we ended up doing is this thing is going on and on and on. Some members from the hospital associations gave me a shout, the people that I've worked with for a long time were like, listen, at this point, the state and these systems are dueling through editorials and they're throwing grenades at each other about this is why it's not working, it's your fault, this is why it's not working, it's your fault, and we weren't getting anywhere. And the reality is that this is a system that can and has saved lives. There's no question about that here in the state of Maine. So they asked me to get involved in the process to try to figure out where we can land with this thing. So that's happened in the fall of 21. And that ended up being a bunch of meetings and a bunch of road shows and going to ERs, talking to acute psych staff, talking about their concerns and trying to figure out with the state how we could stand up a telehealth option at the same time making sure that our officers weren't being put in a terrible situation. And what I mean by that is that our friends on the medical side of the house would say, well, listen, don't bring them to the ER at all. Take them to the police station and do a telehealth assessment from there and see how that plays out. And then if it works, then take them to the hospital. Well, the reality for cops, and Colonel Poulin is here, a true expert and a friend of law enforcement without question. But the reality here is that we're asking officers to de-escalate somebody on their worst possible day, somehow get them to get that individual in a car voluntarily take them someplace else. And in that scenario, you want to go to the station again, de-escalate them, get back out of the car, do a telehealth thing, put them back in the car, and take them to the ER. It's a non-starter for me, and it was from the very beginning, because you're setting up police officers to fail. And that's not something I'm ever going to be interested in. And the reality, when you look at this list, is every one of these people, every one of these scenarios is going to end up in a hospital anyway. Because they're in protective custody. This isn't close. All of these people are blue paperable. They meet that criteria. So we're going anyway. So how about if you just allow us, which is an interesting word in this scenario, allow us to go to the ER anyway, and from there, the compromise is that we'll telehealth outside of that facility. And that worked out. And the state of Maine stood up a telehealth contract with Spurwink, and I'll say his name out loud. Ben Strick runs what they call a living room crisis center in Portland, the Bayside neighborhood. An amazing guy that is really the reason that the telehealth component of this thing works, because he's put time and energy into this thing to make it work on that end. So now police officers would take these people that are in the toughest day of their life, a true behavioral health crisis, take them to an ER where they're going to go anyway, and then telehealth from that location to this living room setting, which is a crisis center where they're seeing patients all the time, 24/7 access from anywhere in the state. They'll do an assessment via telehealth. And then, if they're blue paperable and they're yellow flaggable, in this scenario with these restriction orders, the cops say, hey, thank you very much. They go to the courts, and then the individual is right back in the regular crisis protocols that these hospitals have. So they're getting the treatment that they need. In this scenario, in this conversation, our communities are safer because we're dealing with people, again, on their worst possible day. So that's getting taken care of on that end. We're not putting law enforcement officers in harm's way by jerking them all over the place and come out here and get out of the car and do this other thing. And I think ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to have data and information that's going to show that this isn't nearly as dangerous a situation in our ERs as doctors would initially have expected. So we'll see what happens next. But as it currently stands, the system does work, and it is effective. It could be smoother in a lot of different ways, don't get me wrong. We're not there yet. This isn't a victory lap on my part by any stretch of the imagination. But we do have the right people having these conversations. And where are we going to go from here, and what will that look like? And is this working for Maine right now? And when you look at these lists, these are tragedies waiting to happen. And you'll look at the list, but some of these that, as an example, the one from Westbrook just last night that's not even on the list, that's Westbrook Police Department dealing with a guy 10 times over the last couple of months. Every one of those scenarios, he's threatening to kill himself, he's threatening to kill cops, but they're making a conscious decision. They go, all right, so by us arriving there, we're going to cause more of a problem than not. So they don't necessarily respond. They go to that area, they're there, they start talking to him via text or phone, and ultimately they make a decision that some of that is attention seeking. They have a behavioral health correspondent, they have a liaison that's standing right there with them making this assessment. And they say, all right, this guy's not engaging, we're out. And they go back over and over and over again. So what changes? Ultimately, he says he's gonna hurt himself. He says we, because his daughter lives with him, we won't be around that long. Game changer, right? That goes from now, he's threatening to hurt himself, to hell, he's gonna threaten his daughter. So they take this to the next level, ultimately they take him to the ER. And that's a scenario where he's got firearms in the house, he's making those threats, he wants suicide by cop, and they take him to the ER and they get a yellow paper served on him, and they take those firearms out of the house. So what happens in that particular case will determine in 14 days when they do a hearing. Is that going to continue for 3, 6, 9 months, a year? I don't know yet. But there are a ton of examples here where officers are doing an incredible job and taking it to that next level to make sure they follow the letter of the law and follow the weapons restriction order process in order to make their community safe. So it's definitely a great program, and it's a program that we're lucky to have here in the state of Maine for sure. And I'm glad that our hospital partners came on board. There's a lot of good people that are continuing to work on this thing. and it's come a long way since it first kicked off, 2.5-ish years ago. So I think that's the items that you wanted me to touch on. But again, it is good to see everybody here, and thanks for what you're doing in the communities, and I'm happy to answer anything you got. And if there's a break, I'm hanging out anyway, so if you want something, then I'm here to chat.
Sure, Patrick?
I just want to say real quick, like, not to pick an old scab, right? But we fought like hell against, Commissioner Sauschuck when he went through his, hearings and stuff like that to get on there. And he's been nothing but helpful, you know what I mean, for our community and everything else as we put together these proposals and everything else. So, I mean, if we could just thank you. It takes an open-minded, smart individual to make this stuff happen. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Patrick. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I also appreciated everybody's views through that hearing process and everything else. It was good. I'm glad that it happened the way that it did. I've got no issues with any of that. None of it.
Yeah, my question was, when I was working developing policies, which was for a Fortune 500 company, not legislatively, we were always looking for those items that had what we call the out clause. There's opportunities when it doesn't apply in this particular instance. Things get misinterpreted, statements that kind of happened to me once. It's an interesting story, I'll tell you later.
Okay.
But what happens to the guns once they're confiscated? Are they stored somewhere so that if you found later on that it was somebody had made an accusation against you which wasn't true, and it sounds like there's some safeguards in there with medical professionals that's very unlikely to have happened.
Sure.
Where do the guns go? Are they stored somewhere so you can retrieve them? Because there are some family heirlooms that you may be interested in keeping, or at least giving to other members of the family that you don't have access to them anymore, but they could because there are heirlooms. Where do they go and how are they stored?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting with these two topics is that kind of where that molds together, right? So on the yellow flag side, there's an officer evaluation, there's a doctor evaluation, there's a judge evaluation, and then you go to court, there's hearings, you have an opportunity to give your perspective, you were represented by attorneys. So all of those things, any one of those levels would have an opportunity to change that one way or the other. And then on top of that, if you compare that, or combine that rather, with safe homes, now you have storage that's best case scenario with heirlooms and antiques and valuable firearms, where the officers take those firearms and now they're storing them at the police department. They're not going anywhere. That's not something that would be moved or destroyed or anything. They're just storing them. So if the scenario was I got served an order, it's for a year and a day, you could come back to the police department and pick up your firearms. That's where they're going to be. And I think you could work through your attorney, as an example, if you wanted those taken to somebody else or transferred over. I think those conversations can happen. There's a lot of conversation nationally and certainly in the state of Maine about third party and access to firearms, right? So I'm served with a protection order because of a domestic violence situation. Oh, it's okay, I gave it to my cousin to hang on to. The concern is your cousin going to keep him away from you? He's known you for 30 years, you guys go hunting and whatever. So we want to make sure that they are securely stored, but they go back to the rightful owner, whatever the end of that period is. And I've seen them as low as 3-month consent agreements. Most of them are right around that 6-month. I haven't seen any, I don't think, that have gone. Actually, I think the first one out of Cumberland County went a year. The rest of them are short.
I want to add a little bit to that, because I did serve on a task force around domestic violence from Governor LePage. I was his appointee. And this issue came up around safe storage. It was one reason why, under the safe storage bill that Senator DeChambeau sponsored, there was a component related to law enforcement getting funding for storage, as well as also was a component around communities at risk, say veterans that are at risk of suicide. There was an intention to get grants to help those families store safely during the crisis. So what I wanted to make for a point was that in one case on this task force, it was identified that there was an order to remove firearms from a home. The firearms went to a family member. That family member was berated by the individual the firearms were removed from. He got the firearm back and he used it to kill the individual. that was the point where a lot of us as policymakers realized we have to have a responsible way to store these firearms. This lady in this case did all the right things. All law enforcement did the right thing, but there was a problem. So that's why that component of the safe storage bill is so important. Also, a little later, we're going to be talking with Ellie Espling from Senator Collins' office. There is a federal bill that just recently passed that has a component around safe storage, and so there's a new source of federal dollars to also expand on what we're talking about. So they're all connected.
That's a good question.
Question?
On the first part, you were talking about safe homes. Is that strictly at this point, education to the public on how to keep things safe? Is there any enforcement part to that now, or is there any plan, anything like that?
No, I think that there's zero enforcement aspect to that at all. The educational piece, however, is now going to be ramped up now that we have money, right? So rather than talking about stuff, we can talk about stuff, and oh, by the way, there's an actual grant over here to go buy it safe, which again is very, very exciting. Because we could talk about money forever. It'd be great to actually have one of these come through in a timely fashion, like year 2. To be able to stand something up is pretty exciting for us. And more importantly, for folks that could have access to this money, right? I mean, it's a good deal, sure.
So it looks like there will be another opportunity to ask questions. At this point, I'll hand it up to you. I think we'll take a short break here.
Break time.
Yep, break time.
All right.